was April 14th, 2011, just an ordinary day until it wasn't. Greg Flanagan, a regular guy shaped by his circumstances and personality, found himself at the heart of an impending tragedy. His life was simple, yet that day held an extraordinary twist that would change everything. As a recent addition to the workforce at an oil refinery, Greg was now living in a hotel. It wasn't his permanent home, just a temporary stop. His new job required him to stay there, away from his familiar surroundings. Since he was new in town, he didn't really know anyone, and that led him to keep to himself. Most nights, after work, he'd retreat to his room, seeking refuge from the unknown. Greg walked into his hotel room, shedding his work jacket onto a hook to unwind. He then went to his suitcase and pulled out the clothes he'd wear the next day. With a sense of relief, he peeled off his grimy work boots and trousers, piling them in a corner. Swapping his work attire for pajamas, he grabbed a pack of smokes and a candy bar from the table. These little indulgences were his way of relaxing as he headed to bed. Exhaustion from the day's labor hung heavy on him, and his one wish was to kick back, watch a movie, and let go. Settling onto the bed with his back against the headboard, he made a little space for his pack of cigarettes and candy bar beside him. The remote control was his portal to entertainment, flipping through channels until he found something that caught his interest. And that's when it happened. A sudden, powerful blow, as if the world had turned against him. Pain surged through him. Confusion painted across his face. His legs gave out, and he collapsed to the floor, bewildered and hurt. Susie Flanagan, Greg's wife, was at their usual home on April 14th. She hadn't yet moved to be with him, needing to sort some things first. As night fell, she waited for Greg's call that never came. She tried calling him before bed, but got no answer. She assumed he was tired from work and had turned in early. Morning came, still no word from Greg. This worried Susie, as she knew he'd usually call. Trying his number only brought more silence. Growing anxious, she called his workplace. No one had heard from him since yesterday. Panicking, she asked them to check on him at the hotel. The unknown weighed heavy on Susie. On the scene, two detectives, Ken Mitchell and Scott Thompson, took charge of the investigation. As they stepped into room 348, the stifling heat and the stale remnants of smoke greeted them. At the heart of the room lay Greg's lifeless body. He was face down with legs sprawled out behind him. The only scots on his body were a small rug burn on his cheek from when he hit the carpeted floor. The room was a scene of normalcy. Greg's clothes pulled and stacked up, neatly ready for the next day. His wallet, keys, and room card lay on the table next to the TV. The wallet still contained a stack of $100 bills, dismissing any notions of a robbery. Greg's cigarette pack, lighter, and half-eaten candy bar laid out neatly on the bed, with no signs that a struggle ensued. The detective turned their attention to the possibility of any witnesses on that night. They went back down to the lobby and interviewed the front office reps and manager of the hotel. The hotel manager had already pulled and readied up the video surveillance footage for the evening. Nothing unusual had stood out, and the last and only person to enter Greg's room was Greg himself. The neighbors of room 348 were questioned as well. Most just settling in for one night, apart from the hotel electricians staying next door in room 349. According to the manager's testimony, these two were known to get a little rowdy in the evening and enjoyed the bar scene quite a bit. Aside from that, they were hard-working and reliable employees. With little to go off and no clear motives, the detectives ruled the death of natural causes. While Greg maintained good shape, he was an aging smoker. The medical examiner's team had already wrapped up and transported the body to the medical examiner's office. Dr. Browns would be the one in charge of the examination. He had a good reputation in town as being one of the leading experts in forensic examinations. Dr. Brown meticulously scrubbed the exterior of the body for any scots and lacerations, finding only the rug burn on Greg's face and some minor bruising on his lower half. He made his first incisions into Greg's torso. What he found was puzzling. Greg's organs looked like they had been smashed with a heavy weight. He also sustained a couple broken ribs. What had happened to Greg was a mystery at the moment, but it was definitely a death by natural causes. This was a homicide. Stunned by the discovery, Ken and Scott continued to work the case for clues. They looking for anything that may provide a small glimpse into what happened that night. Months went by, and the detectives had hit dead end after dead end, and the case was starting to go cold. Greg's wife, Susie, was starting to see this mystery slip into the abyss of the unknown. Needing closure to the case, she decided to reach out to a private detective, Ken Brennan. Ken had extensive years in the business of detective work, and the mystery of the case had piqued his interest. He quickly made his way down to Susie to get filled in on the details of the case. She had let him know that Scott Apple was one of the detectives that had been working the case since the beginning. Ken met with Scott at the hotel to go over any details and to revisit the crime scene. They reviewed the footage again of that night and moved into the hotel room. Ken entered the room as Scott was beginning to explain the layout of the scene. Listening intently, Ken's eyes were keen on every detail of the room layout. As he walks over to the bed where Greg would have been sitting that night, he glances down at the wall. A small hole about the girth of a pencil could be seen. The angle of the hole pointed at him as he stood near the bed. Ken told Scott he would like to check out the room next door, room 349. As they walked into the room, Ken went straight for the spot on the wall where the hole had been in room 348. Intrigued, he pulled out his laser point and shined it through the hole. Scott looked at Ken, stunned by what they were looking at. In light of the new evidence found, Tim Steinmetz ended up confessing the story in its entirety to Ken and Scott. This is what happened on the night of April 14th. As night fell, Greg returned to his room, worn out from a tough day at the oil refinery. He settled onto the bed, ready to unwind with a movie. In the room next door, Tim and Lance stumbled back, still feeling the effects of a night of drinking. Their laughter echoed through the walls as they stumbled into their room. Lance had a 9mm handgun on him that night, intoxicated. In the evening, Lance pulled his handgun out from the concealed area where it was kept. Unintentionally pointing the gun in Tim's direction, Tim had told him to point that gun away from him and put it down. Lance lowered the gun and began to place it down on the table when a shot rang out. The 9mm had accidentally went off in the direction of room 348. The bullet fired through the wall and into Greg, who happened to be sitting on the other side of the wall at that moment. The holes that Ken and Scott had found were the bullet holes of a 9mm bullet. When Ken used the laser in the hole, the trajectory was laid out for them. On October 29, 2012, Lance Mueller was sentenced to 10 years in prison.